We do need better solutions to do unlearning, and we need better evaluations to verify if we have successfully unlearned. But we also need to address the gap between the policy's assumption and what we can do from a technical perspective.
This is Privacy on the Ground, where privacy meets real life. Where data lives and flows, it has direct impacts on the methods employed to protect it. As data has shifted from living inside spreadsheets to distribution through data broker APIs to today's complex AI systems, the privacy community has looked toward a variety of technical approaches that promise to protect people's sensitive information. One technical method in consideration as a means of preserving privacy in the AI age is machine unlearning. But the chasm between what some in the policy world might believe machine unlearning can do and the actual technical capabilities of these methods is wide. My name is Kaye. I'm Deputy Director of World Privacy Forum. I got a chance to talk about some of the challenges of machine unlearning when it comes to its application for purposes like data deletion with Kairan Zhao. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Warwick in the UK. Zhao's work focuses on machine unlearning, memorization, privacy, and AI safety, and how those things connect. Machine unlearning is a broad category encompassing a variety of techniques intended to remove or lessen the presence of sensitive information or concepts from machine learning models. In the privacy context, machine unlearning is often talked about in relation to the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation and its AI Act, as well as the California Consumer Privacy Act. You'll recall in our previous Privacy on the Ground episode, I sat down with another machine unlearning researcher, Yezhou Yang, a tenured associate professor in computer science and engineering in the School of Computing and Augmented Intelligence at Arizona State University. Both of these talks took place in March at an academic AI research conference in Tucson, Arizona. It was World Privacy Forum's third year holding privacy tutorials at the Winter Conference on Applications of Computer Vision, or WACV. It's known to insiders as WACV. We invited Zhao and Yang, along with a privacy expert from the legal world, Jevin Hudson, director of the Technology Law and Public Policy Clinic and acting assistant professor at the University of Washington School of Law, to present their machine unlearning related work and to discuss gaps between policy goals and the technical realities of machine unlearning.
We summarize the safety layer into 3 levels, and which we think is also commonly widely adopted. The 3 levels of challenges. Level 1 is so-called domain attribution. Level 2 is model attribution.
However, we all know retraining a model is very expensive. So an alternative way is to apply a learning algorithm on top of the pre-trained model to tweak the model a little bit so that the model can forget.
I think unlearning as a remedy, and then even things like model deletion or disgorgement, if anything, is mutually beneficial to data provenance.
At our WACV tutorials, our aim has been to connect the often disparate worlds of policy and technical AI research in the hopes of helping these communities foster better understanding of the challenges and realities of privacy-related efforts. Kairan Zhao sees the gaps between machine unlearning capabilities and policy expectations firsthand. She and I took a break from the vibrant and sometimes, as you'll notice, a bit noisy WACV conference to talk about key elements of machine unlearning, areas where these techniques are applied, and why there could be a long way to go before machine unlearning can be used at scale as an effective AI privacy tool. Here's my talk with Kairan Zhao. And if you're interested to see some of her machine unlearning research, you'll find links in the show notes. So one of the things I'm really interested in understanding is, what do government policymakers or company policymakers, what do they not understand about machine unlearning? Are there things that they get wrong?
So let me start with some current policies, like, for example, the GDPR from the Europe. It gives individuals the right to be forgotten. And there are some, like many other policies that talk about similar things. And they all talk about like data deletion, and which I think there's might be a misunderstanding this, because it is not as straightforward or not as binary thing as people think, especially for policymakers. So, for example, data deletion might be a very straightforward case in traditional models. So, for example, in databases, if we want to delete a user, we just find the row and we drop the row and it's done. However, it doesn't work this way in modern machine learning models, because the data influence can be baked in millions or even billions of model parameters. So it's really hard and non-trivial to like identify those data influence and remove it. That's why we like study on machine learning, because we think this can be the answer to address this challenge. But yeah, I think in general, it's still like people are just starting doing researching on this problem, and there are still so much left to be done, and it is not as powerful as policymaker to think, because it's still not perfect. Like there's always a trade-off between forgetting versus model utility, and also even for the evaluation, like how would you know if this data has been learned or not? It's a really hard thing to verify. So yeah, I think these are some like misunderstandings for policymakers about unlearning.
Yeah, and we'll probably touch on some of those as we continue with the conversation here. So why did you get into unlearning? Was it kind of based on the GDPR's right to be forgotten and conversations around that, or was it something else?
I actually know about this policy after I studied unlearning, but I have been doing some research on security and privacy in the past. And when I started to do my PhD, I want to work on something related to like privacy or safety, but in more like modern AI systems. And then I did some research and I talked with my supervisors and some other researchers, and they told me, oh, there's this very cool thing to learn. And it has just been proposed, and it's a very new area, and it looks exciting and interesting to me. So yeah, that's why I start doing unlearning.
Wow, okay. And it's really interesting because another researcher who we have speaking at the conference at our tutorial here at WACV, YZ Yang, he suggested that, and there's another interview with him for this podcast, he suggested that, a lot of the kind of impetus for the work that he's done is more in relation to intellectual property, use of copyrighted logos and things like that. And even, extraction of mature or problematic content in a training data set, for example. So not quite like the privacy regulation side of it. So that's a really interesting thing to hear. So would you say that privacy and like right to be forgotten related goals are kind of like the key goals that influence your research and kind of the trajectory of your work, or would it be broader than that? Are there other things?
I would say I think it's gonna be broader than that because right to be forgotten is more like, in my opinion, is more on the privacy side. But as you just mentioned, another speaker also mentioned that there are so many issues about copyrights, about intellectual things. From the privacy side, the issue is more about like, the model can expose some of your private data or some sensitive data, like your ID number, your bank account password, your personal selfies, something like that. And for that, in my opinion, it's more like an example level unlearning. So you want to unlearn this specific data, like your ID number or your picture. But maybe for another perspective, like for the copyright or intellectual properties, it's also challenging and interesting to unlearn a more high level things, like unlearn an art style or unlearn a concept. So yeah, I think these are like all interesting to study and are all promising directions that we need to explore in the future.
Yeah, actually, concept erasure was how YZ told me that's really kind of the term that he always used or still does, as opposed to machine unlearning. And he talked about, for example, like the type of goal of removing model's ability to produce a painting, a painting-like image in the style of Van Gogh, for example. Yeah. Your work has exposed some of the problems related to retain and forget data sets. And these seem like pretty core concepts to some of your work, and I'd love it if you could describe what those are before we dive in a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I think this is more like the part of the problem formulation. Like when we study machine unlearning, we always need to specify like what exactly are we studying here? What is the unlearning goal? And which part of data we want the model to forget, and which part of knowledge we want the model to still retain. So yeah, that's why we split the original training set that was used to train the original model. And we split it into forget set and a retain set. So the forget set includes all the data we want the model to forget. And we want to remove the data influence of this forget set. And retain set basically is the rest of the data set. So, and obviously we still want the model to work well on the remaining data. So yeah, that's why we split the data set into these two subsets. And it's also very important for evaluation because it's in this way we can capture the model or a learning algorithm's performance from two different aspects. We want the unlearning to successfully forget something, but at the same time, we still want the model to be able to work well. So yeah, that's why we have these two subsets.
Yeah, like you don't want the model to unlearn how to work well.
Yeah, definitely. We don't want to destroy the model.
Are these two types of these two sets that you're determining when you're creating like the foundation for a method that you're thinking about, testing or developing, the retain and the forget set, are you usually talking about these things in the context of right to be forgotten removal requests, or would that apply across the board if you're talking about like intellectual property removal, or I don't know, does it matter the end use?
Yeah, I mean, let me first clarify this. Yeah. I didn't create this forget set, retain set split.
Of course.
Yeah. So I don't want to take.
And I didn't mean to imply that you've created the idea of retain and forget sets. Yeah. Just more, it's because that is a foundational element of kind of like it's a primary step that you're taking to determine what is the retain set, what is the forget set. Yes. Maybe it would be interesting to talk about if you have like an end application in mind for what the technique that you're developing or whatever. Yeah. Does it matter what that end goal is when you're thinking about what is the retain set and what is the forget set? Or are there other things that it would be helpful for non-technologists to understand about that?
Yeah. So in my opinion, having a forget set and a retain set could be more useful for example level unlearning compared to like concept level unlearning, for example. Because for example, unlearning, like we have specific targets, we have these specific examples we want the model to unlearn. So yeah, then we can just simply include all of them into the forget set, and the rest of the data would be the retain set. However, in concept level unlearning or like style level unlearning, I think it's a bit hard to identify specific examples we want to unlearn, because we might want to unlearn the whole art style, like the Van Gogh style, and it's probably impossible to list all the data points that has this style. So yeah, I think forget versus retain set is more useful and the more like fundamental setting for example level unlearning compared to other level.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about, because there's so many subjective decisions that might go into how the criteria or the types of data points that you would choose when you're building a data set to train a model to look for signals of Van Gogh's style, for example. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So your work has exposed that unlearning can be more difficult to achieve when retain and forget data sets are entangled. And I think that's a really interesting and important concept for a privacy podcast, because people in the privacy world, especially if they understand how like advanced technical systems work and how they use data, they understand that data sets don't exist in a vacuum, right? It's not just, oh, well, there's this one Excel spreadsheet of data and all we have to do is remove a row, like you were talking about. It's like these data sets don't exist in a silo. They're usually like intertwined and integrated. And I'd love for you just to kind of talk about that idea of entanglement a little bit and why or how that presents a challenge. But maybe even explain some examples of how entanglement might happen that you would be challenged by in your work.
Yeah, sure. So in one of my work, we studied like how entanglement between forget set and retain set affects unlearning difficulty. And we found that if these two sets are more entangled, then unlearning will become harder. But here we study entanglement in the embedding space. So basically we get the features or representations from both sides, and to see how they like try to quantify the entanglement between these two sets. But this might be a bit abstract, so let me give you some concrete examples. Imagine we have a model, and now we want to, and the model can classify pictures. It can tell if this picture is a dog or if this is a cat. And now we want the model to unlearn all the dog pictures. However, some dog pictures might look like, for example, a bear. Then, like in that sense, you can imagine some dog pictures are entangled with some bear pictures. So now when you make the model to unlearn the dogs, would it affect its ability to still tell if bear pictures are bears? So yeah, I think that's an example to explain this entanglement.
And there's probably a decade old or longer computer vision research that I can't remember what it was called, but there's definitely been a lot of work that suggests, the model doesn't necessarily know it's looking at a dog, right? The model might say, well, what I'm remembering is research that showed that the model did not know that a dog was in the image. It recognized that, like, every time it saw this white mass of snow, there was a husky in the there was something like that, where it's like the model it's an explainability issue, right? Like the model is making that decision based on pixels that the human might not recognize. It's making its decision on. I don't know if there's something to I don't know if I made sense there, but
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, that's why I bring up this dog versus bear example, or maybe dog versus wolf is a more appropriate example, because they can look alike. And for human beings, it's easy to tell them, but maybe for the model, you don't know how, like, what exactly the model learns. It might learn the pattern, it might learn the color, the shape, the fur, I don't know. But yeah, anyway, and we think that's like one of the reasons that makes unlearning hard, because if this, for example, we have two pictures that looks similar to each other, then it's hard to just unlearn one of them without affecting the other. So that's my opinion on how entanglement makes unlearning hard.
So you talked a little bit about, like, the challenge of just testing what works and what doesn't, and to know whether or not you actually unlearned information, right? Or unlearned certain types of data or a concept or whatever. Can you talk a little bit about some of the approaches that you have used, or that are maybe state of the art, in terms of, testing these kinds of methods?
Well, I think it really depends on the context of unlearning problem, like which models are you studying and what are you trying to unlearn. So for example, in discriminative models, when we do image classification, we usually use accuracy, like the prediction accuracy, to measure this unlearning. But in generative models, like we don't really have an accuracy there, right? And also for like language generative models or vision generative models, these are also different things. So we need to find different ways to evaluate this. And it's also different for different unlearning goals. If we want to, for example, if we want to unlearn, like memorize examples so that the model will not generate something like that is the exact copy of its training image, then here we can just we can compare the generated images with the training images to see how similar they are, to measure if this unlearning is successful or not. But for more high-level unlearning, like concept erasure, because we don't have specific examples to compare, so there a commonly used way is to use an external model to like try to classify if your generated image is still like classified as this art style or at this concept or not.
Yeah, and there are actual benchmarks that are used for that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah. So there's this benchmark called Unlearn Canvas, if I remember correctly the name. And it's a benchmark about concept unlearning. So basically, they have created a bunch of different pictures like in different styles. And then after you do unlearning, well, they also train an external model to classify, like if a picture is in this style or in that style. Yeah, and after you do unlearning, you still use this external model as an observator to see if you have achieved concept unlearning. Let me first talk about the biggest challenge there when it comes to a benchmark. So for those large models like LLMs or image generative models, because their pre-training data set can be huge, so it's probably hard to identify whether this example has been used in pre-training or not. And there are like many other factors that could happen in pre-training to affect this unlearning process. So what people would usually do is that they create a kind of like synthetic data set to measure this. So for example, there's this LLM unlearning benchmark called Rouge, which basically they created a bunch of fake authors, fake writers, and yeah, like all the information about those authors are fake, and they explicitly train the model on this synthetic data set to ask the model to learn about this information. And then afterwards, they apply different unlearning algorithms and then measure if the model has forget this fake knowledge or not. Because this is a more controlled way to like evaluate unlearning.
It's sort of like a lab experiment.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And so, right. And so, but the obvious, I guess, caveat to that kind of approach is that it might help understand if unlearning occurred according to that benchmark that is totally based on AI generated data, right? Synthetic data. And it doesn't test how does it work in the wild or in the real world, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's the shortcoming of this kind of benchmarks. But I guess this is a more controlled way and maybe a more scientific way to study this. But of course, it's going to be so much harder to study this in real data because, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, there are so many confounding factors there.
So just to kind of cap it off, you and actually YZ both kind of suggested that, you know, unlearning work is it's emerging, it's very young, and there's a lot of, I think a lot of people who look to unlearning in particular as some kind of a solution or an answer to some of the problems that people have with AI-related problematic imagery or mature information or sensitive data or whatever it is. They might not have the patience that the research requires. Do you think that, like, where would you say this world of unlearning is in terms of like how many years ahead or how many years it might take to like get it to really work the way, or will it ever work the way people think it will or want it to?
That's a good question. I think it's really hard to predict that. Let me take differential privacy as an example because people have studied this for decades. But yeah, still, until today, there are still so many researchers studying that because there are still so many open problems in that area. And compared to that, machine learning is much younger than differential privacy, although they kind of study for the same concerns, like privacy concerns. So compared to that, learning is still a very, very young area, and there are still so many questions we don't know the answer yet. And that is actually why, although we aim to provide reliable and effective solutions for those policies or regulations or, just privacy concerns or copyright concerns in general. But I think it's also very important to study underlying characteristics of this problem. So, for example, in which cases unlearning is harder, in which cases unlearning is easier. Because in reality, if unlearning is not a uniform thing, then maybe we shouldn't treat all cases identically, right? And as I talked about earlier, like there are still so many challenges, so many questions we don't know in this area. But I think in the same time, it's also important for the policies to evolve because there's a gap between their expectation and what technology can actually deliver here. So, as I said in the beginning, many policies are under the assumption that data deletion is a binary thing. It's very straightforward. You can just simply remove it. But as I said, it's really hard to do this and also almost impossible, like fundamentally impossible to guarantee this. So we do need like better solutions to do unlearning, and we need better evaluations to verify if we have successfully unlearned. But we also need to address the gap between the policy's assumption and what we can do from a technical perspective, and to, I don't know, maybe reframe the policy a little bit to like kind of address the gap here.
Well, thank you so much for the conversation. And I think actually what you just touched on is why World Privacy Forum comes to these, this is our third year at WACV, and it's to work with people like you to try to hopefully bridge those gaps a little bit. So thank you so much for taking the time, Karen. Great to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's great to see people actually caring about this.
Thanks so much to Kairan Zhao for joining World Privacy Forum's privacy tutorial at the Winter Conference on Applications of Computer Vision, or WACV conference, earlier this year, and for taking the time to talk for the Privacy on the Ground podcast. This is our 20th episode of Privacy on the Ground, and we're celebrating our second anniversary. Yep, we got started in July of 2024. It's a great time to check out some of the episodes you may have missed. Over the past couple years, we've brought so many rich stories about important privacy and AI governance to listeners. From captivating talks with Indigenous data sovereignty practitioners to a deep dive into AI governance at Chile's Health and Social Security Agency, to an informative yet accessible explainer series on the privacy and identity implications of the C2PA content provenance and AI labeling framework, to our recent in-depth series on the evolution of Singapore's influential AI Verify program. If you haven't already, add Privacy on the Ground to your podcast feed. You'll find it on Apple, Spotify, iHeart, or other podcast platforms. I'm Kaye. Thanks so much for listening.